right, so we're picking up from yesterday's lecture, which was about characteristics of living things. The last thing we talked about was naming living things, and we use a system called binomial nomenclature when we classify living things in a taxonomy sense. And that literally translates: bi means two, nomial means name, and nomenclature means a system of naming things. So it's a two-name system of naming things. And we talked about that it's the genus and the species. The genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase, first letter, that is. And then it's either in italics or underlined. And so we're going to pick up today with just running through some examples just to show you correct and incorrectly written scientific names. And this tells us a lot about organisms because, for example, if they're in the same genus, we know that they're fairly closely related. To be in the same species, they have to be able to interbreed with one another. So, for example, Felis leo and Felis concolor. Felis leo is a lion, Felis concolor is a puma. They are the same genus. That tells us they're probably both in a very, they're similar, but they can't mate with one another and make fertile offspring together, so they're two separate species. So remember, the more levels they have in common from domain down, we get more and more specific. It means they're more closely related, generally more closely genetically related. Evolutionarily, if we believe that genetics and evolution sort of go hand in hand, which we'll talk about that. All right, so let's run through these really quick. So the first one, E. coli. You've probably heard of E. coli because it can be a bacterium that causes disease. And notice how the E is just an initial because that's a shortening of it. This is what it stands for. In printed literature, if you were going to be writing a paper about E. coli, the very first time you used the term, you'd write the whole thing out, Escherichia coli, and then after that, you could just refer to it as E. coli. This is not correctly written, however, because the C should not be capitalized, and it should either be underlined or in italics. Same problem with this second one. This should not be capitalized, and it needs to either be underlined or italics. Here's our third one. This one, the capitalization is correct, but it should be either underlined or italics. This one, finally, is correct. So R for Rosa is capitalized, the D is lowercase, and then the whole thing is underlined. So that is correct. This one is incorrect because, again, it needs to be underlined or italics. This one is correct. Capital, lowercase, and then the whole thing in italics. This one is also correct because assuming that somewhere else we had written the full canis here for the genus, it's okay to use the abbreviated initial and then it's italics. And then this last one is incorrect because it's both underline and italics. It should only be one or the other. So hopefully that gives you kind of an overview of how to properly write scientific names. Again, remember, every living thing has a scientific name. They're universal. And if two organisms are the same species, it means that they can mate and make fertile offspring together. If they're in the same genus but different species, then they're slightly different. And obviously, if they're in the same family but not the same genus or species, they're less similar. And so, the more levels they have in common, starting with domain down, the more closely genetically related we would say that they are. Okay, we're going to run through the 6 kingdoms very quickly. So the first 2 kingdoms, archaebacteria and eubacteria, now they actually belong to 2 different domains. This is the domain archaea. This is the domain bacteria. These 2 are both prokaryotic. They're both bacteria. Remember that only bacteria are prokaryotic. It literally, prokaryote means, translates to like before the nucleus. They do not have a nucleus. They're all single-celled. And they generally have cell walls. There are a few bacteria that don't, in general. For now, you don't really need to know the difference between archaebacteria and eubacteria. Archaebacteria oftentimes are like your extremophiles, they're sometimes called, like halophiles that live in salty places, or thermophiles that live in like hot springs, hot places. Eubacteria are the ones you're more likely to encounter, like strep and staph and E. coli and lactobacillus that's used to make yogurt, or the bacteria that are in probiotics, things like that. That's your eubacteria. In general, though, if you just remember that the bacteria kingdoms are your prokaryotes, all the other kingdoms are composed of eukaryotic cells, meaning those bigger cells with a nucleus and organelles. So, Protista, now some books don't even recognize Protista as a kingdom anymore. It's been like subdivided. which kind of makes sense because Protista was sort of like this junk drawer of all the organisms that didn't really fit another kingdom. Like, oh, protozoa, animal-like ones, like amoeba, paramecium, they're eukaryotic, but they're not really animals because they're only single-celled and animals are multi-celled, but they move like an animal and they get their food, they ingest their food, so they're animal-like. So let's just throw them in protist and we'll call them protozoa. And then some of them, algae, well, hey, they can make their own food, algae. They're autotrophic, kind of like a plant, but they don't quite have the cell structure like a plant. They're not complex multicellular organisms that can live on land like a plant. So, boom, we toss them in Protista. And then fungus-like, again, similar characteristics to what funguses have in their mode of nutrition and things like that, but generally single-celled. And so this is like your slime molds, and so we kind of tossed them in Protista. So this is kind of been subdivided depending on what book you look at. It's kind of this gray area. But just be aware that these are small, generally single-celled organisms. A few are colonial, which just means that there are a bunch of cells that live in a group, but they're not really multicellular. Because a true multicellular organism, like a human, I can't just pick any one of my cells and then it grows into another person. My cells are all specialized. So the muscle cells depend on the nerve cells and the fat cells and the skin cells, and they all work together. In a colonial organism, like there's one called Volvox, and it's literally one organism, but it's like this giant ball of cells. And it swims around and kind of acts like it's one organism, but really any one of these cells can survive on its own. So that's what colonial is. Fungi, all multicellular, with the exception, I believe, of yeast. Yeast is actually single-celled. But chitin cell walls, they are all heterotrophic, and they absorb their food. They tend to secrete enzymes that digest the food around them, and then they absorb it through their cell walls. And chitin is the pronunciation, by the way, of their cell wall. It's not chitin, it's chitin. Plants, again, multicellular. They are autotrophic. They make their own food. So heterotrophs must get their food. Autotrophs make their own food. And plants have cell walls made out of cellulose. There are some other general characteristics, tissues and things that they have, but we're not going to get into that right now. And then animals are multicelled, and actually animals are a bit unique because we're actually the only kingdom where none of our cells have cell walls. Plants have cell walls. Fungi have cell walls. Some protists and most bacteria. So the only kingdom where nobody has a cell wall is animals. And we ingest our food. In fact, most animals, if you think about it, majority of them actually have like a mouth and they eat. And there's a digestive system and all that sort of stuff. Some of the simpler ones may not have as much of an obvious ingestion of food, but you see like the development of a head, that's called cephalization, where you have senses and all that sort of stuff. So animals tend to be more complex in that sense, but no cell walls. This is just some general pictures. This is ringworm. Fungus. Remember, it's not actually a worm. It's a fungus. It's growing on the skin. It's digesting the skin, and it moves outward. So as it gets to fresh skin, it secretes enzymes that digest it, and it just keeps spreading into this bigger and bigger blob. These are your different bacteria. These are some protists. They're all sort of single-celled, but they can be very different from each other. And then, of course, plants and animals. Okay, we finally got through characteristics, the first characteristic, living things being organized. Let's jump into the rest. So, living things metabolize. That means that they use energy to grow and repair. This is one of the reasons viruses are not alive. They don't metabolize. Viruses don't make you sick because they're eating your cells. Viruses are just a simple set of instructions. They're not made of cells at all. It's just a set of instructions with a coding around it, no different than a computer virus. And when it gets into your cell reads the instructions and makes more viruses. But true living things use energy. They have what's called metabolism. And they maintain homeostasis. Now, a very obvious one for homeostasis or maintaining this balance would be your body temperature. We can maintain our body temperature. So if we get too hot, what happens? Our brain sends a signal, we sweat, our blood vessels dilate, and we cool down. Dogs will pant to cool down, etc. If we get cold, what happens? Oh, we're triggered to shiver. Shivering actually generates body heat. It brings it back up. So this is called negative feedback. When something gets too high or too low, something happens to counter it, to bring things back to normal. Your blood sugar, if it gets too high, you release a hormone, insulin, to lower it down. If it gets too low, you release glucagon, which raises it back up. So you maintain your blood sugar. This is another picture of another example of this. You do not have to know these specific examples per se. This is calcium. You have to maintain a normal level of calcium in your blood. You actually use calcium for nerve impulses and nerve contraction, and muscle contraction, but you store it in your bones. So if your calcium level gets too high, your thyroid secretes calcitonin, it brings it back down. If your calcium level gets too low, you need more calcium in your blood, your parathyroid releases PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that brings it back up. So you maintain a state of balance. So that's called negative feedback. When something gets too high, something sort of counters it, and it keeps it within this range. All right, so let's talk about energy versus matter. So in living things, when we say living things use energy, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but energy flows through ecosystems. And that's what this is showing here. So energy comes into the ecosystem from the sun in most ecosystems. And then that energy, it's not that sunlight turns into sugar. That is not what happens in photosynthesis. The energy from sunlight gets converted to the energy that is in the bonds holding sugar together. So you're taking matter, carbon dioxide, and water, and the energy from the sun converts that carbon dioxide and water, rearranges those molecules, think back to your chemistry course, into sugar, and oxygen is released. So now a majority of that energy is trapped in the bonds of the sugar. And that's what your producers do. Your producers are capturing the sun's energy. Actually, a very small portion of it, about 1% only. Then, when they need energy for growth, for cell transport, for movement, for reproduction, for all the things that they do, they're going to release that energy by doing cell respiration. And they're going to break down the sugar. That's what the mitochondria do, in part. They are going to break that sugar down, and the energy that was trapped in the sugar is going to be released. And so matter, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, magnesium, all the different elements, they're going to get recycled. Carbon dioxide and water get rearranged into sugar and oxygen. In cell respiration, it goes back the other direction. Nitrogen is part of proteins. When an organism dies, that nitrogen is released, and it gets converted into forms that plants can pick back up. So matter gets recycled, but energy just flows. In fact, the ultimate form of energy is heat. And that got cut off at the bottom here, but the final form of energy is heat. So plants are releasing energy as heat. It is not a useful form of energy. It is kind of like a waste product. As we break down sugar, we are releasing energy as heat. So there's a constant energy supply that's necessary, and that's going to be ultimately the sun. If that burns out, you got no more energy being trapped by the producers. You run out of food for the consumers. Everything would break down. So please keep that in mind. It's a common misconception. Matter gets cycled through ecosystems, recycled or cycles. Energy flows. It's one direction only. Energy does not, you can't go back and add energy back in. Energy, ultimately, it all gets broken down. It all becomes heat. And this is just a little diagram showing how living things interact with each other in the environment. So, the tree is releasing oxygen. It's capturing the sun's energy. It's storing sugars that can be used by or eaten by other animals. It's providing homes. It's providing shade. And that's affecting the ecosystem. So living things all interact with one another. All right, so in our last section, we'll hit on the last two characteristics of living things.